Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. We have over 100 people joining us today from all around the globe, from all sectors and types of organizations. My name is Ron Duerksen, and I'm the Global Executive Director of the International Master's Program for Managers. The IMPM is an executive program with 5 academic partners around the world, and it was founded by Professor Mintzberg, who's here today, over 25 years ago, with the objective of transforming the practice of management around the world. And so today we have several hundred alumni having a positive impact in their organizations and the world, thanks in part to their IMPM experience. This is the first of our Management Impact series, and we hope you will join us for future events, all focused on the positive impact we as leaders can have in our organizations, in society, and on the environment. So let's get started. Today's topic is a 21st century sustainability agenda requires radical renewal. We will have about 45 minutes of a panel discussion and then 30 minutes or so of an open Q&A at the end. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so not the chat button, but the Q&A button, to post your questions or comments for the panelists. Please feel free to do so throughout the discussion as well as during the Q&A session. I will most likely only be able to get it to a few questions, so I apologize in advance if your question is not addressed. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today. Daniel Hires is a social entrepreneur, community builder, and facilitator who currently serves as Director of Partnerships and Communications on the board of the Inner Development Goals. The Inner Development Goals are primarily a communication project to simplify and make accessible the knowledge already existing in the field of sustainability. The basis of IDG's work is grounded in science-based understanding of inner development and what is needed to support a sustainable future. And Rodney Irwin is Chief Operating Officer and a member of the senior management team at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. As COO, Rodney provides leadership of the World Business Council's enabling functions and fundraising. He's also responsible for corporate governance and statutory duties as the company's secretary, and he leads the World Business Council education program. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is the premier global CEO-led community of over 200 of the world's leading sustainable businesses working collectively to accelerate the system transformations needed for a net zero, nature positive, and more equitable future. And Professor Mintzberg, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for almost 20 years now, is the Cleghorn Professor of Management Studies of McGill University's Desautels Faculty of Management, where he's been teaching, researching, and publishing since 1968, since he was about 1 year old. Mintzberg writes and researches on the topics of management, organizations, and business strategy with more than 150 articles and 15 books to his name. Now, Henry, I can't keep track of the number of books and the number of honorary doctorates, but the joke is, do you have a book for every honorary doctorate or an honorary doctorate for every book? In
Yes.
2004, Professor Mintzberg, yes?
Yes,
Henry?
21 actually, 21 of each.
21, there we go. Sorry, I'm behind the times.
You're a year behind.
Excuse me. Yeah. And one coming out next year. So in 2004, Professor Mintzberg published Managers Not MBAs, which outlines what he believes to be wrong with management education. In response to this, he founded 3 successful executive programs at McGill, including the IMPM program I mentioned. In his book, Rebalancing Society, Mintzberg argues that the world has gone out of balance. The private sector has too much influence over the public sector, and the public sector is becoming increasingly polarized around the globe. He outlines how we need to engage in social movements and social initiatives that challenge destructive practices and replace them with constructive ones. As he says, we need not to be passive human resources in the service of imbalance, but can be resourceful human beings in the service of our progeny and our planet. So the discussion today is inspired in part by Henry's ideas on rebalancing society. I want to thank Rodney, Daniel, and Professor Mintzberg for taking the time to be here today. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, who I've also had the pleasure of knowing for over 25 years. Anita Nowak is a Canadian empathy expert, author, podcaster, public speaker, and certified coach who teaches leadership, ethics, and management and social entrepreneurship and innovation at McGill University. As the founding director for the Social Economy Initiative at McGill, Anita was responsible for integrating social entrepreneurship and social innovation into the faculty's teaching, research, and outreach. She also worked with Professor Mintzberg to launch one of the world's first MOOCs, massively open online courses on social impact. She leads Purposeful Empathy by Design, a boutique advisory firm that helps leaders and organizations create empathic cultures. And her book, Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change, is being launched this spring. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Anita. And Anita, I will leave the floor, or rather the screen, to you.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Ron, for that warm welcome. And I'm sure, like everyone who's joining today's Zoom call, we are very excited for this conversation. I know I have been looking forward to it. So I will begin with you, Professor Mintzberg. You write in your book, Rebalancing Society, you quote the American revolutionary Tom Paine. In 1776, he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. In it, he said, or wrote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And in the same spirit, you wrote in your book, "We require an unprecedented form of radical renewal." What do you think Paine meant by beginning the world over again? And what do you mean by radical renewal?
Well, Paine was trying to fire up the American people in the colonies to challenge the British and create something new. And they did it. I mean, it was it came out of a pamphlet he did called Common Sense, which sold, I don't know if it sold or gave away huge numbers, and helped to spark the American Revolution, which was his intention. So it worked. And certainly America, compared with anything that preceded it, at least maybe since ancient Greece, I don't know, was a radical renewal. We need that even more now. Back then, America needed it, and not that many other countries followed till quite a bit later, but it was the model. We need it again, in large part because America is losing its own sort of reputation as a democracy, but also because so many things are going wrong. Just one example, we know that the climate is going to destroy us eventually. We know that many people have already been destroyed, or their homes or their properties or their lives have been destroyed by climate change. So what do we do about it? We have four-year governments making 40-year plans, which are not worth the paper they're printed on. What's the use of a plan by a government that's supposed to be implemented long before it needs to be done?
Daniel, Rodney, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Obviously, we're at a point in time where we know that what we're doing as consumers, but also as employees of large corporations, that we are having a direct impact, not only on the climate, but also on biodiversity loss, as well as having come through a pandemic. We know that not everybody on this planet has the same accesses and equality that many of us enjoy. Are we ready for a period of reboot? I think we need it, but I'm not sure we collectively are invested in making that happen, because there are still people who are vested in business as usual. I think it was Rudyard Kipling that said necessity is the mother of invention. And I'm here today representing the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So I'm here representing the voice of business and the voice of progressive business that does want to see a radical change in the way in which we conduct business. But there is a lot that needs, a lot of moving pieces. And there's the jigsaw, we know what it needs to look like, but we still don't know how to put the pieces together. So I feel that over the course of today's webinar, we may dig deeper into it. But I think in conclusion from me, we need it, but we don't have universal agreement on how we're going to get there. And let's just think about what's happened in the last few weeks at COP27. If there are actually two COPs running side by side, you have civil society, academia, business, all in one space, actually doing really great stuff. But the political will is not going at the same pace. And we can't get governments to move at the pace that they need to do. I don't believe that governments make 40-year plans. I think they're really focused on the next election, not the next generation. And that's where we currently have the problem.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. What I like with the topic of radical renewal is really this word radical, because I think that's really the level that we need. And I think sometimes we confuse radical with extreme, but if we look at it, I mean, radical really comes from the word of the roots. And I think that's really what our times call for, to really look at what is really at the root of what I would even call, or not only me, but is more of even a meta crisis, because we have all of these crises converging, it seems, right now. And I really like this thought of Daniel Christian Wall, who kind of dissects this term of sustainability and says, well, the question behind that is really, what is worthy of sustaining? Is it really the, I don't know, shopping trip from London to New York over the weekend? Is that what we're trying to sustain? Is it, like every aspect of our consumer life that we're trying to sustain? Or is it, if we really dig down to the root of it all, that we are part of life on this planet, one expression of it? And yeah, that I think that it's probably looking too short if the only thing that we want to sustain is us as human beings. But I think the calling is for us to help sustain this iteration of life on this planet as it is. And I sometimes hear this idea that we just want to support ourselves, we want to save ourselves, the planet will be fine. But I really wonder, what kind of a planet do you mean? Because the way that we are dealing or destroying the biosphere on this planet, that will take another tens of millions of years to recover. Otherwise, we just have a dead rock. And I don't know about you, but what I care about on this planet is not necessarily the geologic part of it, but it is the aspect of the life on this planet.
Can I respond a bit, Anita? Yeah.
Sure.
Rodney, in one sense, you're right. We need government action. In another sense, the reason we're not getting government action is because of the influence of lobby groups like carbon energy companies and petroleum companies and lobbyists at COP15 and COP27 and COP out everything else that are getting nothing done, partly because governments don't want to get too much done, partly because they're worried about their economies, and partly because they're heavily lobbied by companies like petroleum, but not only, companies that really don't want to see significant progress. And that leaves out, in some sense, our hope for government and business, with notable exceptions that you represent. But there's a whole other side of business.
Yeah.
And it leaves it to the communities to have to, it's got to be ground up, because governments aren't doing anything, and some businesses are canceling out the good that other businesses are doing. So it only leaves community action that's going to get anywhere. We're getting nowhere. I mean, it's cop-out after cop-out after cop-out.
I agree with you.
Let me jump in with the next.
extent.
Rodney, I want to give you a chance to answer this. Let me frame my question for you to reply, okay? You've already mentioned the COP27 meetings that happened in Egypt last month, where government officials and negotiators reaffirmed the need to keep global warming within the 1.5 degree Celsius limit, but they didn't agree to specific pathways to achieve it. And this week here in Montreal, governments around the world have come together again to establish a new set of goals to halt and reverse nature loss at COP15 meetings on biodiversity. So major global environmental decisions are being made by governments who, according to Professor Mintzberg, are largely beholden to the private sector and may or may not have the knowledge or capabilities to implement the changes that we need. It seems that they're also incapable of agreeing on an implementation strategy. Meanwhile, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development works with over 200 multinational corporations. And as a result, one could argue that it speaks on behalf of the private sector when it comes to sustainable development. IDG seems to be at the intersection between NGOs, government, and the private sector. So I'm going to ask all of you, but I'll begin with you, Rodney. What are your thoughts about this? Who's responsible for putting our climate change and environmental preservation strategy into action?
I think there are four main groups that have a responsibility. And I'm going to start with government. I think many of the reasons why many of the businesses fail to be able to go on a journey that they perhaps need to go in is because the regulatory environment is sometimes used as an excuse for inaction. One of the most fundamental duties of a board member is fiduciary responsibility. And there is continued debate between lawyers as to whether or not being a sustainability leader or going in a certain direction is in contravention of that legal duty to act in the financial best interest of the investor. But there's that aside. But if we look at what we've got, we currently have an unprecedented signed up mandate from COP21 in Paris for climate action. It is the responsibility of government to drive those through what they've committed to do. Now, communities have a responsibility to elect governments that will do what they say they'll do. And I'm Irish and British, depending on who's asking. Currently mostly identifying as Irish because we've offended fewer people. But anyway, political aside. But yesterday, the British government is saying on one hand that they need to do more for climate change. But yesterday, there was an announcement that they're going to reopen coal mines because the market still demands coal. Now, that is a political decision. That is not a business decision. And it is the communities in the UK that need to vote whether or not that's what they want. We have a global commitment to achieve 1.5 degrees, but we're not getting there. And that in many cases is due to government inaction, particularly major economies in the world, and not just the developed world, but across the world. We, as the World Business Council, have representatives in Montreal this week, and we're hopeful of some form of international agreement that again will hold governments to account, because we need the governments to enact what those standards will be that companies that operate within those jurisdictions comply with. But of course, companies need to play their part as well, and they need to play a decisive role in putting climate and environmental preservation into action. We do have more than 2,000 companies that have signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative, but that's not enough. We need more. We do need businesses to be informed by science and to act on science. And I think there needs to be a requirement for that in the absence of leadership. Progress also needs to happen through collective action, whether companies start innovating and following other voluntary initiatives such as the TCFD or the TNFD or the Science-Based Target Initiatives. We're starting to see standard organizations like ISO also starting to play a role. Thomas Hale at Oxford described this as this mechanism as a conveyor belt and an iterative process moving from the voluntary through to standard setting and possibly through to regulation. And I feel that at WBCSD, many of our members, you may be surprised at this, Professor Mintzberg, but many of our members want stronger regulation. They want stronger direction from government to create that level playing field. because I don't represent the private sector. I represent the members of the WBCSD, and our member companies are committed to the most stringent membership criteria of any organization that they voted unanimously for in 2020. And that is to be nature positive, to be net zero by 2050, but not only to commit to that, but to describe in detail how they're going to get there, to address human rights abuses and to strive for better diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to be more transparent than currently is required by law. So that is what our members have signed up to, and many of our members want to see governments take that on. But at the end of the day, we also have a responsibility as citizens, and we have to be consumers that are sustainable. We have to demand better of the products that we purchase, and we therefore need to also ask ourselves when we're in the stores that we're at, why are we buying this? Where is it from? Is it sustainable? Can we do without this product if it's not necessary? So I think there's those four communities. There's the individuals, there is the collective action that we're seeing with the NGO community, and WBCSD is a member of that community. Of course, there's business action, but again, governments play a leading role here, and they need to enact so that we have that level playing field.
Well, shall I respond, or Daniel?
Sure, go ahead, please.
All right. Wow. By 2050, we'll probably be dead from nuclear holocaust, if not other things. Reading the news, watching what was going on just this year, the floods, the fires, and everything else, it is absolutely a joke to talk about 2050. I think it's a joke to talk about 2025. I think this is accelerating at a rate that is horrific. And talking about things we plan to do 2020, 2050. Look, you and I, Rodney, can go back and forth on whether we're blaming government or business. I think we need to blame both, and I think we need to blame both together. That's not to say that there are lots of wonderful businesses that are truly concerned. They're building windmills, they're building all kinds of things, they're doing all kinds of stuff, and there are all kinds of people in business who care deeply about this and act. That doesn't change my point that there are all kinds of business people who are doing everything they can to block this. And it's well documented. The number of lobbyists representing the petroleum companies at COP26 and COP25 was clearly stated. So I think we have to stop kidding ourselves. This is not a question of and just look at the U.S. Congress and look at the money that has to come in from business to support both the Democrats and the Republicans. And so, of course, they know which side things are on. And of course, government is not acting for that reason and other reasons. And of course, therefore, we need radical renewal. And that means we need a ground up movement, not a ground up, but a ground up movement. I hope it doesn't become ground up, but we need a ground up movement that will force our institutions to act and not pussyfooting. Let me give you a stupid example, because I think it's so indicative of what can be done. In Paraguay, which is a rather corrupt country, one senator got off being prosecuted for corruption, and he got off. So the women in the country went down to his house and started pelting it with eggs, day after day after day. Finally, the smell got to him, and he resigned. Okay, it's a stupid little example, but it is an example of what concerted action on the ground means. And until we get that in much more major ways than throwing eggs, there's no use occupying Wall Street. Wall Street is a street. It's not the problem. The problem happens behind the doors at Wall Street. That's where they have to take action in legal but aggressive ways. Otherwise, we're finished. We're finished. Wake up. It's not 2050. My God, it's laughable. It's just laughable.
I'd let Daniel reply as well, but I would like to come back to you to say that to follow up, just maybe to further the debate.
Sorry, I didn't catch it.
So I'll let Daniel reply, and then we can have another conversation around another perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that we are really in a situation where I would say it's very difficult to just point fingers anywhere. We need all hands on deck. I think we need action from every level, and I absolutely agree. We need a much stronger civil society that is holding those in power accountable for their actions. And I really like this idea of talking about us as citizens and not just consumers, because I believe, of course, that we have to take responsibility for our actions as consumers. But I think the debate is tipping a bit too far in that direction, where it seems like if I just buy organic milk, you know, like I'm doing my part. And I think this is part of an individualism that is part of the problem. I think what we need to do is we need to get together and use our collective action as citizens, as people who are, at least in our democracies, have some form of power over those who are representing us. And I think that's probably the more important story. And yeah, to me, it's not about like pointing fingers at anyone, that they are the ones that need to act first. I think we need leaders from every part to realize the situation that we are in, and that we need radical action on all of these levels.
And I think we're all sort of agreeing the same thing, that there is a radical shift in all aspects of humanity that need to address, that needs to take on board these challenges. But I would like to go back as to this timeline, and I think we also, by changing things by 2025 is really unrealistic. You know, business is the engine of employment across the globe. It is, even dirty industries hold significant value that, if they were to disappear overnight, would be detrimental to society. And so we need to create managed declines to get away from those technologies, those interventions that are creating the problems that we have today, but to do so in a responsible manner, so that the maximum amount of value that can be extracted from those organizations is attained. And that's why I think it would be irresponsible to say that we need to change everything tomorrow. We need to ensure that we have a responsible transition, that we have a just transition, so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to basically use an Americanism. That we need to identify where we have that value, extract it, and put those practices that we have got to out of sight. So I think at WBCSD, we also are adamant that we need a radical shift in the way in which we run our businesses, the way in which they're regulated, the way in which investors invest. But we also have to be responsible about how that is done, to ensure that we do not inadvertently create unintended consequences. Our pensions are invested in these companies. Our livelihoods as we grow older are invested in these companies, and we therefore need to be responsible about how we transition. I agree with both speakers that we need to transition urgently, but we also need to be responsible in that journey.
So this is a beautiful segue into another line of questioning. I'll begin again with Professor Mintzberg. In 2003, so that's nearly 20 years ago, you've published a very famous article in the Harvard Business Review in which you outlined the 5 mindsets of a manager. It's a framework that's being used in several successful executive programs now. I wonder if you could share what those 5 mindsets are, and why do you believe they're key to achieving success, especially with regards to climate change mitigation and halting the general degradation of our environment?
Thanks. Thank you, Anita. Well, We did it because we were trying to design. I'm not a believer that MBA programs train managers. I think they almost distrain managers. They do a wonderful job of training in the business functions, like marketing and finance and accounting. But you don't become a manager in a classroom. That's why we created the IMPM, which is a whole different philosophy. You bring in people who are managers, who know what management is. We're not trying to make them into managers. We're trying to enhance their ability to manage by sitting at round tables and spending half their time reflecting to each other and reflecting on their own experience and sharing it with each other based on what we as a faculty present in the other half, the other 50%. So, and once we decided to do that, we had to get rid of the usual structure for MBA programs, which is around the business functions, because we didn't design a business program, we designed a management program. So based on some of my earlier work on what managers do, we came up with a framework that basically says what managers do can be described as coming between action on the ground and reflection in the abstract. And great managers are excellent at both acting and being on the ground and knowing what's going on in detail, not in financial statements. They're abstracts in detail about what's going wrong in the factory and why these customers are not buying the product and so on. And often you get that by walking through your own stores if you're in retailing. And then being able to take that up to a conceptual level and reflect on it in a broader sense. So we have the action mindset at the end, as it happens, and we have the reflective. We start with the reflective mindset, we end with the action mindset, and then in between, management happens on three levels. It happens in organizations. We call that the analytic mindset. It happens in relationships. We call that the collaborative mindset. And it happens in the context around the organization, which we call the worldly mindset. And we call it worldly rather than global because it's not about being cookie cutter the same. It's about being uniquely global, uniquely worldly. So understanding other cultures so you can understand your own culture, both national and organizational. This can serve as a framework for talking about the issues we're talking about today, because we are reflecting on experience and lots of experience has been cited. We are reflecting on it. We're trying to attain some kind of collaboration or common ground. And we're trying to be sophisticatedly worldly and not just narrowly global. And we're talking about doing it through organizations, whether they're NGOs or governments or businesses. So the framework works.
So Daniel, to pick up on this, because it's interesting, the interdevelopmental goals, let me repeat this. The Inner Development Goals, your organization, right? The IDG framework also helps organizations make progress on the SDGs. It's a model that's actually remarkably similar to Henry's 5 managerial mindset. So I'm just wondering, how were your IDGs conceived, created, and how are they applied?
So the history behind the IDGs was actually conceived through a project or a question of a Swedish gentleman who was really wondering, why is the current society in Sweden or in the Scandinavian side of the world so different of Europe, of the rest of kind of the Anglo-Saxon world? And what he was looking into was that around the turn of the century, in Sweden, there were these places where any person could go for up to 6 months for free and work on their inner developments and work on their kind of personal development skills. And the argument that he makes is that by the time the Industrial Revolution then came to Sweden, there were around 10% of the population who had gone through such a training. And that actually led to a completely different way of how then society was structured around this newfound wealth. And so this was his initial inquiry, and out of it came this belief that this is the missing piece in looking at something like the SDGs as, the solution to a very complex problem. And that's how the Inner Development Goals were born, through this simple question of what would be the skills and qualities that we need to develop today in order for us to reach the Sustainable Development Goals or similar complex challenges around sustainable development. And so we designed a one-question survey, and we had over 1,000 people answer that. And with a group of scientists, we kind of brought it together into 23 IDG skills and found that they group very much along 5 dimensions, which are being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. So we have this acting, I think, that is very similar. We have the collaborating, which I think is very similar, as well as the analytic and the thinking mindset. Where I think there is maybe a bit of a difference is that in our being category, it maps somewhat to the reflective self, but I think there's somewhat of an additional dimension there that it talks about what maybe we would call purpose today, of really people being grounded in what is really their sense of why they're here and why are they acting. And I think the other part on the relating, I think there's also a lot of overlap there. But one thing that I would perhaps add is that the relating is not only relating to other humans, but that we need to also look into how can we relate more to life around us, including nature around us. And so that's where the framework is. And well, to be quite open right now, it's still a framework in development. We realize very much that this has been developed kind of with a very Western bias. So over the next 2 years, we want to go out and bring in many more voices into this dialogue. So for example, we're talking to the government of Rwanda right now who want to implement this. And they asked, where is forgiveness? We have a lot to say about forgiveness. And so, yes, we realize that this is still a framework in development, maybe even a living framework. But yeah, our partners are already using this to shape the way they think of inner development, of leadership development in their companies. So one example is one of our partners is IKEA, and they've been working on leadership development for a long time. It's not that we're bringing something new to them, but this framework was very useful for them to find a way to frame the learning outcomes of their leadership development programs. And we hope that this language that we're providing is a way for us to have more dialogues around what kind of inner shifts we need.
Well, I love that we're talking about worldly mindsets. I love that we're talking about getting out of sort of the Western framework. Here's a question for the panel. Along those lines, it's widely understood, right, that Indigenous peoples across the globe have lived sustainably for millennia, and they have a reverence for all sentient beings and a deep understanding of our core interdependence with nature. What do you all suppose we could learn from Indigenous peoples around the world, especially with respect to developing a set of strategies to reach the SDGs? How could they inform us about this radical renewal that we're talking about?
I'm happy to give it a go. I'm lucky in that one of my good friends and also professor in residence at WBCSD is Professor Gil Whiteman, who is a social anthropologist who has actually researched Indigenous communities in the First Nation communities actually in Canada. So I've had an opportunity to reflect on her work. And I think there's a lot of similarities between Indigenous populations and what we should be doing with business education. First and foremost, Indigenous people are managers of the environment. They are people who have an innate duty to survive and to thrive in the environment within which they live. And many Indigenous populations live in extreme environments, although not all. They, however, have the most deep and intimate understanding of the context within which they live and operate, as well as the local ecology. And they're also, I think there's a lesson for us in business, that they're constantly seeing the signals that nature is telling them. So they are actively gathering information on a daily basis on what things are changing, how it's changing. This is on a daily basis as well as on a generational basis. They're also very practical, and when they see changes, they're able to experiment with solutions to that change. So, for example, the First Nations communities in Northern Canada, and I'm sure the same in the Lapland regions of Europe, they were seeing climate change long before it was popular. They were seeing it because people were falling through ice that previously didn't happen. And so they had to carve out different solutions to be able to survive and thrive. And I think so what we can learn from Indigenous people is this ability to keep our eyes wide open and to have an understanding of the world around us and the planet. And, you know, I think that there was a lot of conversation at the beginning about lobbyists and what business can do better and why business is perhaps a force for evil in some respects. But I would go as far as to say that business schools have a hell of a lot to answer for here as well, because they're not teaching science and social science for managers to be able to interpret. We are too much focused on the administrative side of business without allowing us to have that worldly view of what really is going on in the planet. And I think we could therefore learn from Indigenous populations about that intimate relationship that we have with the planet on which we have a dependency for our survival. They also accept that we're in this together. So they have a deep appreciation of all aspects of nature, not just themselves, but their relationship with animals, their relationship with flora and fauna. Their leadership comes from this knowledge. And, you know, they are also very much aware that they have a responsibility to leave things as good as they found them. And I'm not sure that we have learned that in the business world. I think we have relied too heavily on a form of capitalism that is extracted and not renewed. That doesn't mean that we want to throw capitalism away, but we need a fundamental reboot of capitalism so that it does acknowledge that we have a responsibility to pay back. I think the last thing I would say about Indigenous people is that they have a deep connection to their past and their ancestry, but they also have a strong view of what's coming in the future. And I think that, and linking this maybe to Daniel's work in the Inner Development Goals, in my interactions with Indigenous people, what I'm most struck by is the humility with which they work. And their humility, I think, is something that we have lost. Certainly, the products of MBAs tend not to be the most humble people on the planet. So that would be my tuppence worth.
Maybe I can pick up. I'm doing a blog. My blogs are mintzberg.org/blog, and I'm doing a blog called "What is Dumbing Us Down?" Because you see so much inanity around today, so much just thinking, whether it's left or right or business or government or anything else. Hey, God, wait, sorry. I don't know how to stop this. Sorry about that. I need to close my phone. There's so much kind of weird thinking going on in all respects. I don't care whether it's, as I said, left or right or government or business or anything else. There's huge amounts of it. We're just not thinking. And so I wrote this TWOG about what is dumbing us down. And I offer various possible reasons. You know, one is the pace of life and the pressure of life. One is the demise of community or the weakness of community. And people feel apart, they feel isolated. One is toxic chemicals. Who knows what they're doing to our brains, the stuff we inhale and ingest and absorb through our skin. Another is toxic electronics. You know, we are just inundated with electronic messages and Zoom calls and everything else driving us crazy. We have no time to stop and think. So anyway, I wrote all this up, and then I discovered that Yuval Harari, the guy who wrote the book called Sapiens, in another book called 21 Messages for the 21st Century, gets into this a little bit at one point, where he says the farther we get from nature, the more we kind of lose it. And of course, all four things that I mentioned are taking us away from nature: the pace of life, the isolation from community, the electronic harassment, the toxin chemicals. All those take us away from nature. And so Harari's points straight to your question, Anita, and straight to Rodney's answer, which is that the native people had that right. And it turned out, after all this time, to be the models. You know, we came in superior because we had guns and other things, and suppressed them totally. And now it turns out they had a lifestyle. I don't want to there was plenty of killing and murdering there too, but in general, they had a lifestyle that was much cleaner and more sensible than the lifestyle we've created for ourselves. We talk about progress. Progress means we can wipe ourselves out. If one person in Russia decides to do one thing stupid, and you know what that is, then we can wipe ourselves out, and we call this progress.
Yeah, there's a lot here. I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think just to pick up on one thing, I think there's this 7-generation thinking that, especially with the accelerated like time that it seems like we cannot really think much beyond our own lifespan, maybe like the lifespan of our children, but thinking really 7 generations further into the future, that's not something we're really used to. And I think it's expressed by just this idea of discounting the future in economics, that $1 next year is worth less than $1 today. And I think we can really learn a lot from how they are treating the rights of the unborn in the future. I think the second thing is, yes, there is this idea that there is really this connection to nature. And I think, like, if we're thinking again about the radicalness, about the roots of it all, the way that I understand it is that they kind of see something fundamentally different from the way that we see things when we talk about buying a piece of land, buying real estate, owning that real estate. I think where native thinking comes from is that we are owned by the land. We belong to the land. And what we need to do is that we are responsible stewards of this land. Because I think the way that we are thinking lends itself very easily to this idea that then if we can own it, we can dominate it. And this is where I really think I see the parallels to business, because that's oftentimes something that I think also can come very easily into a business mindset, that we want to dominate a marketplace, that we want to just, like capture everything. And I think the times call for a lot more collaboration. And I think collaboration is what happens when we see ourselves much more as a steward to this. And then maybe just one last point. Rodney mentions that they had this idea of leaving things as good as it was before. I would go even a step further, because to me, this leaving as good as it is before sounds like the mantra of do no harm. And I think where we need to move towards is actually an active participation in creating the good. So I know that, for example, some plants like sweetgrass depends in a way on human interaction for it to thrive. So it's not just that what we need to do is kind of remove ourselves and try to not have any negative impact, but that we can, as active stewards, really be part of nature around us thriving.
Beautiful. I'm seeing that we have 5 minutes left during this formal part of the panel before people can start asking questions. We have an incredibly diverse audience joining us, people from who are working in different industries and sectors and countries. And by all means, you can start to populate not the chat box, but as Ron said, the question box with any of your questions. I'm going to merge my final 2 questions together as part of the final formal panel. The first is, my own research suggests that we can tap our innate capacity to empathize, to lead towards significant personal, organizational, and social change, that empathy can be a real driver. So I'd like to ask what role you think empathy could play in all that's been discussed today. And as a second question, what concrete actions can we take at the individual and at the organizational level to contribute toward radical renewal? And whoever wants to begin, by all means.
Well, I could start off by, I mean, this is something that I've been struggling with for the last 30 odd years as a professional accountant. I think doing my training in the economics and accounting, empathy was certainly not something that was on the curriculum. But as a human being, I am an exceptionally empathetic person. But I feel that empathy without compassion, I think you need to look at both of them. So for me, empathy is the ability to feel what another person is feeling, but it's also to have the capacity to feel with them. One of the reasons why I have moved into my work at the World Business Council is because I have a passion for the work that I do, but also that I want to ensure that all of the skills and the training that I have can be put to a good use. I think that empathy is the #1 attribute of being a human being, first and foremost, and we have way too little of it in the world. And I think I already mentioned, and maybe I'll go on a bit of an attack on the business school community, but I think in the last 30 years, the business school community has not been teaching managers to have empathy or leaders to have empathy. It's been teaching them to have the ability to fight, to kill, to strive for more, and not necessarily to reflect on what is enough or what is sufficient. We're at a point in time where I feel that it's probably the best point in time where we can talk about how we're feeling without being seen as weak. Because again, business schools, in my opinion, have created leaders who have been, in many ways, robotic in the way in which they present themselves. Now we have the ability to be vulnerable and to use vulnerability as a strategy to show that we don't know all the answers. And that, I feel, is what also helps create a bit of empathy. So my one takeaway, and I did this over the last 2 years in my leadership position at WBCSD, is to be open, is to be authentic and to show who I am. And that is to show all of the bad stuff, all of the stuff I don't know, as well as the stuff that I can contribute, and to allow people to see that it's okay and the world doesn't stop if you are authentic and if you are vulnerable. And that I think gives me strength. I think that gives me the opportunity to wake up tomorrow and want to seize another day to, you know, I might not make it by 2025, Professor Mintzberg, but at least I know that I'm doing something every day that's making a difference. And I'm doing it responsibly, and I'm doing it transparently, and I'm doing it authentically. Because at the end of the day, I'm not going to look back on my deathbed and say, I wish I had worked harder. I maybe would be more disappointed in myself if I didn't work differently. And that's what I feel empathy brings for me. And as a chief financial officer in a multinational organization, I'm very proud to be empathetic and vulnerable.
And Rodney, perhaps if I could add to that, I think what you're then also creating is what Amy Edmondson would call the psychological safety in your organization, because you're modeling kind of this, that it's okay to kind of bring your full human self to the organization. And I think that really rubs off on others. And I mean, in her research, she's shown that this is one of the 5 key dynamics at Google that really build strong teams. And perhaps it's one of the most essential or basic ones there. And I think then, to me, that ties into what can we do? There is this idea of Bob Keegan of the deliberately developmental organization, which takes that perhaps even a half step further, where it's that to create organizations where we're all invested in kind of helping each other work on the weaknesses that we see, that we leave that out in the open, that we're even expected to show our weaknesses, so that everyone else in the organization can support us when we want to become better and in addressing these types of weaknesses. So that could be, I think, also a step for many business leaders to take and to bring that in. And yeah, I would really say that I see that there's more and more interest for inner development at also even a top management level. But what I hope for is that this can really trickle down through all of the organization, and that every single employee can really benefit from leadership trainings and opportunities to develop and grow personally within their company.
Like both of you, put empathy on top, not necessarily the top, but high up on the list. Somehow this feeling that when we're acting or even considering problems or recognizing them, we're not only recognizing what our friends are experiencing or what people with our lifestyles are experiencing, but we can somehow bring ourselves to empathize with people who have very different situations. As I kind of write about rebalancing society, I'm constantly stopping myself and saying, I'm writing from a Western perspective. I'm not writing for someone who's living in a slum in Nairobi or wherever. I'm writing from a Western perspective. And so how do we sort of get there? I think that's the idea of the worldly mindset. The worldly mindset is to put yourself into somebody else's place. In our IMPM program, every participant spends time observing another manager and vice versa, back and forth, ideally in another place, another industry, another country, another situation. And that's meant to enhance their worldliness in the sense that they see other people's problems as those people see them, and then realize, well, maybe they're not so different from our problems after all, if we can only bring that in. So, so every time I'm writing about rebalancing society, I'm trying to push that empathetic side of it. I'm working with someone who's doing a doctorate in education. He's a community organizer, and he talks about street walking. And street walking is getting social workers not to come down from their haughty houses in fancy parts of town, but to walk the streets of the communities they're trying to connect with and see where those people are eating, and go to the entertainment that those people go to, and visit their homes if they possibly can, and kind of live their lives. It's kind of like our managerial exchanges in the IMPM. Live their lives, and that way develop a sense of worldliness. By the way, Daniel, when you say being, to me that's closest to the worldly mindset. You're being worldly in the sense that you're understanding other people's worlds. So I'm trying to figure out now how to work street walking into what I'm writing ahead in the future about rebalancing society. How do we street walk our way into radical renewal?
Wow. I'm going to pass the baton back to Ron, because I know there's questions from the audience, I am sure, but I have found this a riveting conversation, and I'm just really grateful and honored to have participated as the moderator. Over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Anita. So a lot of the questions I see in the chat are actually asking to go a little bit more in depth on some of the things you've already touched on. So I will address one of the questions from Bettina, which sort of, Rodney, you touched upon, and Henry, you did a little bit as well. But what role specifically do you think business schools have in this radical renewal that's needed to reach the Sustainable Development Goals? You know, Rodney, you represent the World Business Council, the education mandate of the World Business Council, and Henry, you've been in education most of your adult life. What specifically do you think business schools or universities in general, let's talk about secondary or actually any education, what role needs to be played, and how do things need to change, if at all?
I can give it a go. I mean, also in the interest of full transparency, I'm also a professor of accounting and sustainability at Leuphana University in Germany, and I'm on the faculty of the Yale School of Management. So I am part of the fabric of business school. I'm also a research fellow at Lancaster University, and I see the logo behind you. So just putting that out there to show that I'm actually part of the system that is broken in business schools. So we started off this conversation, with Professor Mintzberg having very strong views on the way in which business is perhaps misbehaving. I would like to flip that round and say, we really need a radical shift. Business schools need to go take a long, hard look at what business schools are doing. It is broken, and the system is broken. From tenure, which results in difficulty to get deans to drive change in the curriculum of business schools, through to the way in which you're ranked and rated, because don't want to be the person that throws your toast butter side down, but you need business to recruit your students and give them huge salaries, or your rankings don't really matter much. So the system is broken. We're also teaching people business as usual. Sustainability and the ethical side of business are still too much on the outside as optional extras. And I've worked this year with a large business school in Switzerland to try and embed more sustainability into it, but not all faculty is comfortable teaching it. Not all faculty is comfortable doing it because they don't know. And that, I think, is the interesting thing here. If you go and watch the Inner Development Goals video, which I think is the best 5 minutes you can do for yourself this year, Amy Edmondson sums it up when she says that it's hard to learn when you already know. And many people in business know what they've been taught at business school. Therefore, it's hard to learn new skills. And many people have left business schools with the inability to have any capacity for inner development because of an MBA at the end of their name, and they think, I know everything. So I think that the system is fundamentally broken, and that business schools, whilst they may want to attack the business community for not doing enough, need to have a long, hard look at themselves and reflect on the changes that they need to make. Now, I teach in the executive MBA at Yale, and I have this year a group of 31 amazing executive students. And I've been teaching them the inner development goals, and I had tears in people's eyes. That's what they want. Students want to have that emotional, empathetic, compassionate perspective, not just how to do good accounting, or not how to create a great business plan. They want to have a human touch. And I'm afraid that that's not necessarily coming through. There needs to be a radical shift in the way in which we teach. There needs to be a radical way in the way in which I think Henry has been saying for years, that we have more reflection, that we teach people to be managers, not leaders, because trust me, it is up to other people to decide if you're a leader, not you. So yeah, I could go on at length, and Lancaster University, Dr. Alison Stoll and myself, along with 2 others, have recently written a book chapter that's just been published that goes into a little bit more detail on this disconnect between business practice and business school activity. And it took 7 years for that to actually get published, which says it all as far as I'm concerned.
So I'm not going to argue with any of that.
Thank you, Rodney.
The last part. except to say that there are all kinds of professors in business schools, including us and Anita, who's teaching. So there are plenty of people with different attitudes, but I won't argue that business schools have it much too easy and make too much money doing damage in some respects. The AACSB, American, no longer American, but Association of Business Schools, had me down to a conference they ran in New York a little while ago, because they're interested in the whole issue. They're interested in ethics. They're referring to it as ethics, really, in business school, MBA or business school programs. And they're interested in rebalancing society as one of the things that could be done. So there's there are those kinds of things that we could be teaching and letting people know. But ultimately, it's about attitudes and beliefs and models ourselves, in fact, on faculty as role models. I mean, it really comes down to that. And if you have faculty who are non-empathetic, if you have faculty who couldn't care less about the problems of the world, but only in turning out people who are going to make tons of money on Wall Street, then what can you do? But it's comfortable. It's comfortable. The guy who foisted shareholder value on us sort of did a kind of mea culpa years later. Well, that's too bad. The damage is done. There's still a widespread belief that business's role is to maximize shareholder value, and to hell with everything else.
I could maybe just add one further comment there on the business school side, which is, don't be a business school, be part of something bigger. And that is ensure that the business school has a very close relationship with other faculties, so that, as we discussed when we were talking about the Indigenous people and the way in which they have this intimacy with the world around them, a business school and an environment school should be best friends. A business school and the social science faculty should be best friends. They should be co-creating, they should be working together. And finally, I would love to see research getting out to business leaders in an accessible format, not in some highfalutin, hard to access way, in language that makes sense to the person that actually doing it. And business schools could learn a lot from medical schools. Medical curriculum used to be that you didn't get your hands near a human being until 4th year, unless they were dead. Now you get to see them in the first week. So what can we learn about looking at systems thinking that business schools have implemented, or that medical schools have implemented, and not just looking at the traditional managerial curricula that produces robotic output?
Yeah, and so I do a little bit of
Sorry.
teaching also at some business schools, and for me, I think, yeah, there is this kind of silo thinking. It's like thinking that, okay, because it's a business school, that is the only thing that we're teaching. But I mean, I teach not on the executive MBA side, but more the younger people. And I mean, these are still kind of young adults who I think to get a well-rounded type of, I don't even know if we can just call it education or like a formation of some sort, that there's a lot of other aspects that we need to think about. And of course, I'm going to say that we need more inner development aspects in here. I think like those questions lead also very quickly to, even philosophical questions of, what does success really mean to you? Are you only looking to become a millionaire by money? Or would you maybe like to prefer to become a time millionaire and just have, like that freedom? What does really kind of wealth mean to you? What type of businesses are we building? Are we optimizing for efficiency, or are we optimizing more for resilience? And then I think one thing that I find lacking with a lot of kind of the programs, there's a lot, but one thing that I would like to pick out is something that I see is courage. I think that we are living in an environment where increasingly this interconnected world is reducing diversity. It seems like there's a regression to the mean. I mean, if you look at the recent car designs or whatever's like being put out as modern architecture, things are looking increasingly similar. And I find that really sad. And I do also think there is a lot of potential there to break out of this mold, but we're not going to break out if we're always following all the same design gurus that we look to, if we're always listening to the same 5 management consultants. But really, we need courage to break out of this and do something different. And of course, we're going to fail by doing that. But I think there's no way to really get to a radical renewal if we don't also, if we're not ready to fail a couple of times on the way there.
Thank you, Daniel. There's been a lot of discussion in the chat, again, about going a little bit more in depth on this debate of who's leading, government, business, or what Henry calls the plural sector, and society. So I'd like to go back to that point and maybe ask each of you separately. Rodney, you were a little bit critical of politicians and politics, that they need to lead the way. Henry, your point was that the private sector is lobbying governments, and so governments are, some ways, have their hands tied behind their backs. And Daniel, you represent an NGO that kind of is in between those 2 sectors. So I'll just go back to that issue, because there's a lot of interest in going even more in depth in that. Rodney, what do you think governments should do, and how can there be radical renewal in politics? Oh, you're muted, Rodney.
Before I get to that question, maybe just spend a few seconds explaining my disdain for politics. I'm from Northern Ireland, so I come from a place where politics is just divisive. You can either vote for people who have a foundation in terrorism, or for people whose fundamental right-wing Christianity would have me stoned. So my relationship with politics somehow is flavored by where I come from and the way in which, religion and politics and nationalism and politics played a role. So once I try to get over that, and trust me, it's a hard thing to do, even with empathy and compassion, and look at where we are today, I think we have people entering politics not to be public servants and to act in the public interest in general, but perhaps be power crazy, or to have control. And I think that's different. I feel that governments need to, as I said already, live up to the commitments that they've signed up to, and not do what we saw in the UK yesterday with opening a coal mine. That's just insane. You've set a target, you're doing this. That should be held to account in some way. And hopefully it'll be at the next election, but you can't always count your chickens. I personally feel that career politicians shouldn't be allowed. That's a personal view. I feel that if you really are going to be entering politics to be a public servant, do it for a defined period of time and move on. Because I feel that's where you have the issue that I think Henry was saying at the beginning, where you have this lobbying, inappropriate relationship that stands over many, many years. From a business perspective, we would like to see regulation enacted that creates a level playing field, that forces the acceleration of the transition to a low carbon economy and to nature positive, as well as legislation that creates better understanding of fiduciary responsibility as it relates to the way in which leaders lead. So I would like to see politicians elected and held to account, because they're not. And promises, as we saw with the climate policy and the pledges that they made in Paris, don't really hold for much. And we saw that in COP most recently.
Yeah, should I
Yeah,
pick
go
up?
ahead, Henry.
We're getting nowhere on the major problems. We've been getting nowhere for years and years and years. We go round in circles. We're really getting nowhere on climate change. We're getting nowhere on income disparities. They're getting worse by the day. We're getting nowhere on the demise of democracy and the rise of populism. All of that is getting worse, not better. So we need to kind of see things a bit differently, which we're calling radical renewal. Let me just give you one story. And by the way, I'm sympathetic to the argument about career politicians, Rodney, but I'm going to give an exception, namely Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Depending on your politics, you may not appreciate him. I think he was one of the most important American presidents of all time. And when a Black activist asked him to support his cause, Roosevelt said, "I know, I agree, I want to help. Go out and make me do it." And I think it's all right there. It's not business that's going to do it. Business can help and business can contribute. It's not government even that's going to do it, although it has to listen to the people. It's the people, it's the population, whether it's call it the plural sector or civil society or communities. They have to be the one to go out and make people do it. And that's what we're in desperate need of right now. As far as being held to account, let me give you another story, Rodney, of being held to account. The Business Roundtable, which is, as you well know, the heads of major American corporations, has had 4 statements on shareholder value or the like. In the 80s, they supported the idea of stakeholders, although the word wasn't common in those days. Then in the late 90s, they said it's impossible if you, and Jack Welch championed this, how can you possibly, adjust or make decisions based on all kinds of stakeholders? You have to concentrate on shareholder value. In other words, Welch was saying that the chief executives of American corporations don't have judgment. They can't possibly use judgment to make these distinctions. 2012, they changed their mind, reversed it completely. Stakeholders were back. Good, terrific. 2019, we all know that one because that was not that long ago. Another statement that said exactly what they said in 2012. Well, talk about being held to account. Well, what did the Business Roundtable executives do between 2012 and 2019 such that they had to issue the same statement again without even referring to the earlier statement? So yes, governments have to be held to account. Yes, everyone in positions of authority have to be held to account.
Thank you, Henry. Daniel, did you want?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think we need accountability in all of those organizations, in all of those structures. I think that it's probably too late to talk about, any single actor that is most responsible. We need it kind of from everywhere. That's why we're also trying to really work with all of the different actors and existing structures to bring kind of the awareness that we're looking for into them. Another thing that I would just like to add is what I find quite interesting is to bring in the judiciary on this. And I think there are some really interesting developments on looking at, can we make ecocide illegal? And I think that I see that as also very interesting, very promising area. Where we can see that, can we as a society just define that, just like we do not want to see or we punish genocide, that we also see that killing nature systematically is a form of crime that we do not accept as a society.
Building on that, excuse me, we will be ending shortly, but in the chat there were 2 questions related to Indigenous peoples and how we can relate better to what they can teach us. One of them was this comment that maybe we need to go beyond sustainable development and talk about evolution or adding something positive to the environment. So going even beyond sustaining and actually contributing positively to our environment. And the other is comments from Priscilla, who's actually an IMPM grad, who's the first Indigenous Canadian bishop in the Anglican Church, and she was wondering, how do we go beyond just building relationships with Indigenous communities from an elite or paternalistic or Eurocentric point of view, and how do we actually incorporate this wisdom and the sharing of practices, and and can we get to a point where we are thinking, I think you were getting to that point, Daniel, beyond just sustainable development, but actually contributing positively to our environment in that way. Kind of a general overarching comment, but the question is, how can we go beyond sustainable development, and should we be going beyond that? And how do we involve Indigenous communities and diversity and inclusion in general, going beyond lip service?
I'm not sure I have the answer to any of that, but I maybe share a little experience I had in Sweden a few years ago. I was invited, again, at WBCSD, we tend to get invited to talk about our work to a business audience. And I shared the stage that day with an Indigenous lady from the Sami community and a reindeer called Sven. So it was the most bizarre experience I've ever had, being on stage talking about the role of business with a reindeer. But I think it goes back to what we've been talking about all day today, which is this idea of empathy. You couldn't but be empathetic to the plight of the reindeer community and the Sami people when that community was in front of you and you saw the impact that the climate change was having in the way in which that community survived and ultimately sought to thrive. And I think that's what we need. We need more visibility of these leaders, and I would call them leaders because they truly are in our business schools and in our conferences. They need to be on the stage telling us what they're seeing and how they're dealing with it. And I feel that brings us back to Daniel's work at the Inner Development Goals. It is hard to learn when you already know, we've established that, but it's possible to learn if you are put into an environment that allows you to learn. And I feel that experience will stay with me for the rest of my life because it was unique and it was authentic and it allowed me to have empathy for that animal as well as that human being and to have compassion. And that's what this is all about. And you're not going to get that from a textbook. So I would encourage Indigenous communities to be the leaders, get on stage, and for schools like the ones that on the list behind you, to bring those Indigenous people forward in conferences like this. That's real diversity. It's not having somebody from Europe talking about business, but you're going to Brazil next, I believe, get somebody from the Amazon, talk about what's going on there. That, I think, is what the business community needs to hear.
Thank you, Rodney. Daniel, do you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, perhaps I would say that we need to go beyond just like getting these people into the areas where we're talking and into the areas where action is happening. So how can we get Indigenous wisdom into the boardroom, into advisory positions of large organizations, into positions of power in government? I think that's really where things get interesting, when it's kind of not just about who is, on stage and being heard, which is of course also important, but really who has the power to make decisions that affect the kind of systems that are affecting our lives. And I think the second thing is, yeah, I would absolutely agree. We need to go beyond this idea of do no harm into how can we actually be good stewards of life on this planet. And one thing perhaps that could help us is this idea that Phoebe Tickell calls imagination activism. And I think that's something that really is triggered by this idea of how can we be adding positive things, because I think it's somehow in our human nature that it's difficult to just say, like, I don't want to do more harm. But I think if we can open up our imagination to what wonderful things we could be contributing as the one species on the planet currently, as we know, that has reached some form of consciousness, how could we perhaps then lift up other species? I mean, thinking maybe now way beyond 7 generations, perhaps Homo sapiens is not the only life form that could reach consciousness one day. And if what we are doing now is destroying the biosphere in the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years, we might never know. And perhaps that is, or I find that something very inspiring, that you know, I would love to go down in some kind of history or so as kind of the species that helped all other life forms rise up and really life to flourish on this planet.
Thank you, Daniel.
Other than agreeing with pretty much everything I heard on this, the most empathetic I can be is to say that this question should not be answered by me. It should be answered by Indigenous people.
Thank you, Henry. I'm conscious of time. We're going to end in a minute, so I just want to ask you each of you, including Anita, in one sentence, what gives you hope? Who'd like to go first?
Many young people.
Thank you, Henry. Rodney?
Yeah, I'd say the students that I teach, not always young, by the way, although some of my undergraduates are, but the people that I teach are the people that give me hope, because I see in them a thirst for something different. And that's why I go to bed in the morning.
Evolutionary scientists
Daniel?
have studied our evolution, and we as human beings survived and thrived as a result of our empathic proclivity. And when we come together, we can move mountains. So I have hope because a critical mass of us understand, despite the big business, despite the big government, that we need to change things, and it's happening. The radical renewal that we're seeking is happening, and I have hope that we'll get there.
Thank you, Anita. Daniel?
What gives me hope is looking into some of the past changes that have happened, and they were not linear, but there was a point where things accelerated, whether that was a woman not like sitting in the front of the bus, or people sitting in the counter where they were not allowed, and that triggered change that was unthinkable a year before that.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And so I think we will end now, just to respect the time. I want to thank all our panelists and Anita for moderating today. It's been a real pleasure, and what gives me hope is working with people like yourselves. It's inspiring. It shows that there are leaders in the world are really thinking about these things and want to see concrete change. Little side note, Henry, I love your example from Paraguay, because that's where I was born, and I'm actually Paraguayan, and I never ever hear anything about that country. So thanks for that little example or anecdote. And I want to thank, of course, our audience that has come from all over the world. That includes IMPM alumni and members of the World Business Council and Inner Development Goals. And I just want to thank Daniel and Rodney for agreeing to be part of this today, and Henry and Anita, of course, for your time and energy. So thank you all very, very much. We will end the formal conference now, and you will receive a follow-up email with the recording. And please feel free to join us for future impact series from the IMPM program. Thank you very much, and have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.